In the summer of 2023, a trail camera mounted to a cypress tree deep inside the Big Cypress National Preserve recorded something that had never been captured before. The researchers who pulled that footage sat in silence for a long time before anyone said a word. Not because of what attacked, not because of what died, but because of what the footage proved was already happening. Quietly, without any government program, without any funding, without any human intervention at all, in the most damaged ecosystem in North America. And when the lead scientist finally spoke, he said they needed to pull every other camera they had in that preserve immediately, because this changed everything they thought they knew. Here's what nobody is saying out loud. 2 decades of crisis management, billions of dollars, tens of thousands of hunters, helicopters, drones, radio transmitters, professional removal teams working year-round, and the Everglades was still losing. The pythons were still winning. The mammals were still gone. The silence that biologists described, that eerie, suffocating absence of life after driving for miles through habitat that used to move and breathe and call out from every direction, that silence was still the default, still the baseline, still the new normal, until it wasn't. To understand what the footage actually showed, you need to understand what the Everglades really was before any of this started. Not a swamp in the way most people picture a swamp. A slow river. 1.5 million acres of shallow, warm, ancient water moving imperceptibly south through a sea of sawgrass toward the ocean. It filtered drinking water for millions of people. It absorbed the force of hurricanes. It recharged aquifers stretching across South Florida. Scientists who calculated its ecological value stopped at $31 billion a year and noted that number was conservative. The life inside it was staggering. Wading birds in flocks so large they blocked the sun. Alligators in every waterway. Raccoons, bobcats, white-tailed deer, marsh rabbits, foxes. A food web built over thousands of years, layered and self-sustaining in ways that took generations of research to even partially understand. Then the pythons arrived. And they did not arrive the way an invasive species is supposed to arrive. Slowly, tentatively, struggling to find a foothold. They arrived and immediately began consuming everything in front of them. A single female lays up to 100 eggs per clutch. The heat of the Everglades is identical to the heat of their native range in Southeast Asia. There are no natural predators. There is no winter. There is no famine. There is only prey that has never, in tens of thousands of years of evolution, developed any behavioral response to a 40-pound ambush predator that can hold its breath underwater for 30 minutes and read thermal signatures in complete darkness. The native mammals did not run, they did not adapt, they simply disappeared. In the hardest hit survey zones, raccoon populations fell by 99.3%, opossums by 98.9%, bobcats by 87%. Marsh rabbits and foxes in certain areas dropped off the charts entirely. Not reduced, erased. Florida's response was everything, and none of it was enough. The Python Challenge launched, drawing hunters from across the country, cash prizes, news cameras, the whole spectacle. The math was merciless. By 2024, the competitive hunting events had removed roughly 200 snakes total from a population that most credible estimates place between 100,000 and 300,000 animals. Professional contractors working year-round since 2017 had pulled more than 23,000 pythons from the field. Researchers ran the numbers and concluded this represented somewhere around 5% of the total population. Thermal drones failed because pythons are cold-blooded, and the Everglades is already warm. Mechanical decoys failed because ambush predators do not chase things that run. The Judas Snake program, tracking a captured python back to its social group to find and remove more animals, worked at a small scale. It could not be replicated fast enough to matter. Florida had deployed every tool it had, and the population held. In some areas, it was still growing. Then something started shifting, not in the removal numbers, not in the government programs, in the snakes themselves. Field teams working the levees began noticing that traps, which had been productive for months, would go cold. Hunters returning to locations where they had taken animals the previous season found nothing. Not because the pythons had been removed, because they had moved. Deeper into terrain that humans could barely navigate on foot, away from the access roads, away from the walking paths, away from every corridor where a human being was likely to appear. Dr. Mike Bartoshek and his team at the Conservancy of Southwest Florida documented this shift across multiple field seasons and could not fully explain it. Whether individual snakes were learning from encounters with hunters, or whether human pressure was simply killing off the ones that lingered near human activity and leaving only the cautious ones to reproduce, the result was the same either way. An apex predator that was already almost impossible to locate was becoming incrementally better at not being found. Without any training, without any instruction, just through the relentless filter of survival. And while the biologists were processing that, something else was moving through the Everglades that nobody had seen coming at all. Its name is Rhabdias orientalis. Researchers call it the snake lungworm. It arrived with the Burmese pythons. It had been spreading invisibly through the wetlands for years before anyone identified it. Dr. Christina Romagosa, a research scientist at the University of Florida's Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences, first encountered it during routine health assessments on native snake species. Garter snakes, pygmy rattlesnakes, animals that should have been perfectly healthy. They were emaciated, struggling to move, breathing with visible effort. When she examined them, she found the lungs packed with small worms burrowed into the tissue, blocking airways, feeding on blood from inside. She had to step back from the examination table before she could continue. Because what she was looking at was not a local problem. It was a systemic, invisible invasion that had been running for years without anyone catching it. The transmission chain is one of the most unsettling things documented in modern wildlife biology. An infected python leaves waste in the water. Cockroaches pick up the larval parasites from that waste. Frogs eat the cockroaches. A native snake eats the frog. Inside the native snake, the larvae do not stay in the digestive system. They tunnel through the stomach wall. They migrate to the lungs. They attach, multiply, and begin to fill the airways. The snake weakens. Eventually, it suffocates. Researchers documented animals dying with worms visible in their mouths. When scientists mapped the spread, they found it had already moved beyond the Everglades entirely. At least 18 native snake species were infected. The lungworm was detected as far north as Jacksonville. And the detail that changed the entire picture: it no longer needs the python to keep spreading. It is now transmitting between native snake populations on its own. Even in a world where every single Burmese python was somehow removed from Florida overnight, the parasite would stay. Self-sustaining. Permanent. The food web was being dismantled from two directions simultaneously. The pythons consuming the mammals from above. The lungworm collapsing the reptile populations that hold the middle of the food chain together. Two crises feeding each other, accelerating each other, with no clear intervention point on the horizon. But here's where the story stops being only about collapse. Dr. Romagosa's team, in the middle of all of this, found one species that kept coming back completely clean: the Florida cottonmouth. A venomous pit viper living in the same infected habitat, exposed to the same parasite vectors, showing zero signs of infection across multiple survey sites and multiple field seasons. No worms, no respiratory distress, nothing. No one could explain it. Something in the cottonmouth's biology, its immune response, its blood chemistry, the particular composition of its venom, was creating an environment where the parasite simply could not establish itself. If that resistance could be identified and understood, the implications were enormous. Scientists flagged it as the most urgent, unanswered question in Florida wildlife biology. The answer to the lungworm crisis might already be living in the swamp, invisible, waiting for someone to ask the right question. And then, Florida announced something that made most of the internet declare the entire state had lost its mind. They were going to release more snakes. The animal was the eastern indigo, the longest native snake in North America. Iridescent blue-black scales that catch sunlight like polished metal. Up to 9 feet of muscle, speed, and jaw strength. A confirmed ophiophagus, a snake eater, that pins prey with its jaws and swallows it alive. Completely immune to the venom of every pit viper native to North America. Rattlesnakes, cottonmouths, copperheads. The indigo eats all of them without any consequence. For thousands of years, it was the apex predator of the forest floor. Then human development paved over the longleaf pine forests of North Florida through the mid-20th century, collapsing gopher tortoise populations the indigo depended on for shelter, and the snake vanished with them. By 1978, the eastern indigo was functionally gone from North Florida. For decades, conservation groups had been working quietly to reverse that. Captive breeding programs, longleaf pine restoration, gopher tortoise reintroduction at the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve. Building the entire ecological foundation the indigo would need before any release could succeed. In late 2023, a trail camera at the preserve captured what the researchers had spent 50 years working toward. 2 eastern indigo hatchlings moving through the underbrush. Not released animals. Wild-born. The first eastern indigos born in the wild in North Florida in half a century. Dr. Kevin Eng, herpetologist with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, was among the first to see the footage. He watched it twice. Then he picked up his phone to call his colleagues. By his own account, his hands were not entirely steady. The king was reproducing, on its own terms, in the wild. And it had never encountered a Burmese python. At the same time, something else was happening in the south that nobody had designed or predicted. Native predators that had spent 2 decades being consumed were beginning to push back. Dr. Bartoszek's team was tracking a 50-pound Burmese python named Loki through the Big Cypress Preserve when the telemetry signal stopped moving. When they reached the coordinates, they found a carcass. The python's head had been taken off. A trail camera nearby had recorded the entire thing. The killer was a bobcat, 25 pounds. Half the weight of the snake it had just killed. It had tracked the python, identified a window, attacked at the precise angle, and won. Bartoszek went quiet for several seconds when he watched the footage. Then told his team they needed to pull every other camera in the area immediately. And it was not an isolated incident. Reports were coming in from across South Florida. Alligators targeting pythons at water crossings. A Florida panther on camera bringing down a mid-sized snake in the sawgrass. Native predators across multiple species were locating the same vulnerabilities. The brief sluggishness after a large meal. The exposure during a water crossing. The small window when even a perfect ambush predator is not fully alert. They had found the gaps. They were learning to use them. This is not a turnaround. The pythons are still winning on numbers. A bobcat cannot reverse 20 years of ecological destruction in a single kill. But the dynamic has shifted in a way it had not shifted before. For the first time since this crisis began, the force is moving in both directions. That alone was something researchers were not prepared to see. And here is where everything converges into something nobody planned and nobody fully understands yet. The eastern indigo population expanding south out of North Florida is now on a trajectory toward the northern edge of Burmese python territory. The python range has been creeping north, following warmer temperatures and connected waterways. These 2 ranges are approaching each other. Nobody knows exactly where they meet. Nobody knows exactly when. But the encounter is coming. An eastern indigo built by evolution to hunt snakes, facing a Burmese python that outweighs it by 40 pounds. The indigo does not use size. It uses speed, jaw strength, and a grip it will not release under any pressure. It has taken down rattlesnakes. It has taken down cottonmouths. It has never in its evolutionary history faced anything like what is living in the southern Everglades. No one has ever documented that fight, and there is a darker layer under all of it. The lungworm is spreading north. If the eastern indigo expands its range into infected territory before anyone has established whether it carries any resistance, it walks directly into a parasite that has already crossed into 18 native species, with no known defense. 50 years of breeding programs, habitat restoration, and careful reintroduction work arriving at precisely the wrong moment. Walking straight into Rhabdias orientalis before the collision even has a chance to happen. That is what the footage from the Big Cypress actually revealed. Not a victory. Not a final collapse. Something far harder to categorize than either of those. A broken ecosystem building a new kind of equilibrium out of collisions between forces, none of which answer to any human plan. An invasive giant that has rewritten the food web of South Florida. A microscopic parasite with no loyalty to any species. An ancient apex predator returning from the edge of local extinction. And native animals that spent 2 decades being erased, now beginning, slowly, imperfectly, to fight back. The bobcats are learning. The king is breeding in the wild for the first time in 50 years. The cottonmouth is carrying a secret that might unlock the answer to the parasite crisis, if anyone can figure out what that secret actually is. The swamp is not dead, but it is fighting on every front at once against enemies that did not exist here a single generation ago. So who wins? Does the eastern indigo reach the pythons before the lungworm reaches the eastern indigo? Does the cottonmouth's resistance unlock something that changes the entire trajectory of this crisis? Do the bobcats learn fast enough and teach each other? Does the python range keep pushing north until everything meets in one place at the same time? Nobody has those answers. Not yet. And that is the thing that the footage makes impossible to ignore. For the first time in 20 years of watching this ecosystem slowly come apart, the outcome is genuinely uncertain. Drop your prediction in the comments. Hit subscribe now. The swamp still has more to show us.